Hi everyone, this is Ellie Perry, Sustainability Manager at Cal State Dominguez Hills. Today's presentation is going to be covering Food 101 from the CSUDH Sustainability Office. So hopefully as a result of this presentation, you'll be learning a lot more about food and how to make a big impact when it comes to your environmental footprint. So the important thing to mention about food is that it's really important to sustainability for several reasons. One of the biggest reasons is that it has a big impact in terms of where the average American's carbon emissions are coming from. So when it comes to their greenhouse gas impact, food is a major contributor. However, it also has the benefit of being very easy to change because everyone has to eat sometime. So making decisions at every meal can actually have a big impact on those carbon emissions. So when we talk about influences on your carbon footprint, there are a lot of simple choices you can make when it comes to food. So for example, the biggest choices you can make involve deciding what you eat. So basically making the decision between eating meat versus plants at a given meal will have a big impact on your carbon footprint. Picking out food based on how it's farmed or processed will also have a big impact. And also where it's from will also have an impact on your greenhouse gas emissions when it comes to your food choices. However, it's not for the reasons that you think, which we'll get into. So in terms of the learning objectives at the end of this presentation, hopefully you'll understand a little bit more about the environmental impact of the foods we eat, understand how to make more sustainable food choices that help the planet, as well as understand what sustainable food resources are available to you here at Cal State Dominguez Hills. So what's the beef with meat? If you've noticed, a lot of environmentalists really advocate meatless Mondays, trying to go vegetarian or vegan. So to help understand that argument, purely from a sustainability standpoint, the main conclusion that we can draw based on the environmental impacts of animal proteins is that they're not sustainable. If you look at some of the stats there, major portion of our Earth's resources go to supporting agriculture for animals. And as you can see, big impacts in terms of our land use, how much water goes into animal production, including the feed that feeds the animals, as well as the proportion of global greenhouse gas emissions that come from animal agriculture are pretty significant. And the reason for that is that it's pretty much a scientific fact that for every pound of animal protein that you result in, it takes about 10 pounds of plant protein to feed that animal. So when you think about it from an environmental standpoint, you're basically multiplying the environmental impact by several times. For example, instead of just taking that 1 pound of grain, let's say, and feeding yourself, you're instead taking 10 pounds of grain and feeding it to an animal to only result in 1 pound of animal protein for yourself. So as you can see, there's a lot of loss of efficiency when it comes to making the transition from plant proteins to animal proteins, which results in that massive environmental impact. So that also naturally results in a lot of embedded water costs. So a lot of people don't realize that in order to save water, one of the best ways you can do that is actually changing your food choices or not wasting food. So for example, you can see that smaller animals tend to have less inputs required to support them. So as you can see, if you start with something as small as a chicken, that takes about 518 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of chicken. However, if you go up to pigs and then up to sheep and then up to cows, the amount of water that goes into feeding their food crops that they eat for their feed tends to go up quite rapidly. So there's a lot more embedded water that results from different animal protein choices. So this also translates to a bigger carbon footprint. So if you see the graphic below, this kind of displays the greenhouse gas emissions that come from 1 kilogram of food, and how much CO2 results from that 1 kilogram of food. So if you take a look at the scale, pretty much the plant proteins are pretty low on that scale when it comes to carbon impact. However, the second you start going into animals and animal byproducts, that impact starts to go up significantly. So by the time you get to, let's say, a burger all the way to the end, it's almost creating more emissions than driving around in your car. So there's definitely a huge impact in terms of where you pick your foods in terms of being on this scale. And obviously, the larger the animal, the more inputs it takes to feed that animal to produce it. Basically, moving to smaller animals will also have an impact on moving further down the scale, in addition to trying to go all the way at the end and actually focusing more on plant proteins. In addition to deciding whether you eat plant proteins or animal proteins, there's also some significant environmental impacts based on the way that food is processed. So process actually does matter as well. So obviously beef has the biggest carbon footprint, but the same food can also still have a range of impacts depending on how it was created. So for example, if you look at the chocolate bar example there, if you pick a chocolate bar that has that integrates sustainability principles, that has really low impact practices, it has a certain level impact, right? But if you get another chocolate bar that doesn't incorporate those sustainability practices, it can easily range into having more greenhouse gas impacts than beef that's been sustainably harvested or sustainably farmed. So there are some variations in that, though overall, no matter what you do, generally a portion of the highest impact vegetable proteins will still emit way less than the lowest impact animal proteins and animal byproducts. So those are all things to consider when you're looking at your food choices on a given day. Within the plant protein options that you have, generally they're still less intensive than meat, but not all veggies are created equal. If you look at the graphic to the right, you can see there's very different water impacts based on what you decide to eat. So for example, one orange will take about 13.8 gallons versus a pistachio, which might take 0.75. But obviously, if you have more pistachios, that might outweigh the oranges. So there are embedded water impacts to everything you eat, even when it comes to plants and fruits. So the reason why there's kind of this imbalance between different types of vegetables and fruits, a big problem is the way that people have been trained. So in general, when you go to the store, you expect convenience. So regardless of the season, when you walk into a store, you generally expect that you're going to have access to a wide variety of fruits and vegetables, regardless of whether that's actually the growing season for that fruit or vegetable, or whether that's appropriate for the region that you live in. Because we have access to so many different foods that we can import from all over the country as globally. The other aspect to think about is that it's always in an unrealistic quantities. So if you actually had to farm a head of broccoli yourself, you would actually realize how much input and how much water and how much everything else goes into making that head of broccoli. However, because you walk to the store and you're able to basically pick out as many heads as you want, that tends to result in a lot of waste at homes. So there's an average statistic that about 25% or a third of all food produced in the US actually gets dumped because people basically buy too much and they never get to it. So, how many of you have actually gone in the store and bought a way too big bag of salad and watched half of it go bad? So that's very common, and also basically throws away all of the environmental inputs that went into creating that food item. Also, another thing that results in a lot of waste on the storefront side or the back end is that we also have been trained to expect cosmetically perfect food every single time. So for example, if you buy an apple, and it has a scratch on it or a dent, but it's still perfectly edible, that'll likely get thrown out at the store because they don't want to sell cosmetically imperfect food. So that results in a lot of waste in stores where, maybe that carrot's a little bit deformed, but it's still perfectly edible. That will go immediately into the trash bin, whether that's at the farm itself or at the store when it arrives. So there's a lot of issues with food waste in the country in general. So solutions that you can look at is adjusting your food choices to local growing conditions, because that gives you a good indicator whether that the environment can actually sustain that crop. So instead of demanding, products all year round, where it's like, no, I absolutely need my mango or my avocado. You don't know if basically to meet that demand, there's other parts of the world where they're basically overutilizing their environmental resources to help meet that demand so they can make money. So adjusting food choices to local growing conditions where you can actually see the changes in season and realize, hey, it's summertime, berries are in season right now, so it's sustainable for me to actually buy this, as opposed to demanding berries in the middle of winter where you have to ship that across the country, or demand this from some foreign country that's basically going to pour all these resources into satisfying my demand. So farmers markets are a really good way to stay in tune with that. Something called CSA boxes, which are community supported agriculture. So if the farmers don't necessarily want to go to the farmers market all the time, they can actually create boxes based on subscription, where you pay a fee weekly and they can actually deliver to your house, or you can actually go pick it up from local farms. So that's also another way to get access to local produce. Also, another important point is that you always want to avoid food waste. As you can see, there's a lot of water, there's a lot of resources that go into making every piece of food that we eat. So you want to make sure that you're avoiding food waste as much as possible. So not overbuying, not just dumping things because they look ugly, donating where you can. That's all ways that you can avoid food waste and avoid those wasted environmental impacts. The next question that you naturally get is, well, if plant proteins are always better than animal proteins, a lot of people think, well, I should just buy anything that says vegan on the label. So that's not always correct. So another thing to factor into your food buying is that you need to watch out for over processing. So a good example, let's say that you're deciding between buying a salad or buying a garden burger that's vegan. If you're going off of this assumption that vegan is always better, you might shoot for the vegan burger. But something that you need to incorporate is, well, if you think about it, it has plant proteins in it, but in order to make that burger, you had to put a lot of chemicals into it. You had to put it into a factory. You had to make sure that it was processed. After it was processed, it was packaged. So you had to put the plastic sleeve on it, and then the cardboard, and then the labeling. And then it finally got to you. So there's a lot of added steps to whenever you over process something versus, let's say, the salad. So let's say you even buy a head of lettuce from a local farmer at the farmer's market. Doesn't really come with that much packaging. It comes straight from the field. So basically you wash it and you're done. So if you, in terms of looking at the environmental impacts, not having as many steps to process can have a lot of impact on the environmental footprint of that product. Even if it says vegan on the label, there are still differences. So hopefully that's something to keep in mind. So the next kind of common go-to is that people then assume, well, I should just buy things that only have organic certification, right? If I want to reduce my environmental impacts. But an important thing about labels and things that claim to be eco-friendly or green is that other than USDA organic, there's almost no policing of the terms that you'll see. So for example, if you pull up a bag of bread, it'll say, all natural or non-GMO. And it's important to note that that's not backed by anything. So any company can say that they're all natural or non-GMO, but that doesn't mean anything. So, in terms of actually policing the terms, don't get tricked by the extra marketing. And even the USDA organic label just means that they're certifying that that farm is using fewer pesticides. That doesn't really account for any of the other environmental impacts, including land use, how they treat their workers, how they harvest, anything like that. And also it tends to be very expensive for small farmers. So there might be a small local farmer that's actually doing more sustainable practices, but they may not necessarily be able to afford the $10,000 a year fee just to get certified to document that. So certifications aren't necessarily the be-all end-all when it comes to making sustainable food choices, but they are a good start. It's better than nothing. So when you are looking at certifications or those labels certifying that they're more sustainable, definitely make sure you're looking for labels that are actually third-party certified by someone who's not at the company. As well as those runs by nonprofits. So for example, Rainforest Alliance is run by a certification program run by a nonprofit. So you know that their main concern is really rainforest protection, not necessarily just selling products willy-nilly as you would if the label came directly from the same manufacturer. So that's important to consider about where those certifications are coming from when you're looking at the label on food. So the next kind of common go-to is people then assume, well, local food is better because of the transportation impacts. And that's not necessarily the case when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. So local food is still good, but not necessarily because of that transport assumption that most people make. And the reason for that is that that depending on your mode of transport, there's different efficiencies. So for example, if you're ordering, grapes or something from Chile, if it arrives to you via a cargo vessels are actually quite efficient. So if you think about massive container ships, they're actually able to carry massive amounts of weight in proportion to their fuel. It's pretty efficient. So that 1 pound of strawberries or grapes being on a massive cargo vessel that's hauling very efficiently, individually is not going to make a big impact on the greenhouse gas footprint of that product. However, once you get into different other types of transportation that are more localized, so for example, if you're shipping something via a heavy truck, a truck can only lift so much on that fuel source. So if you're shipping things via a truck, it actually adds to your greenhouse gas impacts more than if you'd shipped it via ocean on a massive cargo vessel. When you get into air impacts, that's even worse, and that's generally why flying in planes is so frowned upon, because it takes a massive amount of fuel to carry very little weight. So for example, if you're shipping lobsters live from Maine to California and it needs to be air freighted overnight, that's going to have a way bigger transportation impact than if you, again, ship something via cargo vessel from overseas, but it took, the slow boat over, so it doesn't really use as much fuel. So that's kind of the fundamental kind of transportation question. But when it comes to local food, there's a lot of other benefits which still make it very, very valuable. So local food is generally better. Number one, because of freshness. So who actually wants to eat a grape that's been on a boat for 2 weeks, right? If you can get a grape from California that was literally picked out of the field yesterday. So in terms of the freshness element, this actually helps with food waste as well. Because by the time that you buy foods that are really from really far away, it's kind of at the end of its life cycle. So you might only get a few days or maybe a week out of that bag of salad or out of that fruit box before it actually rots on you, right? Versus if you buy something local, that's going to last a lot longer and reduce your likelihood of having to throw it out before you actually get to eat it. Also, in terms of the sustainability principles, we also want to support local communities. We want to support our local economy. So actually putting your food dollars into local businesses and local farmers can actually help your community thrive. So as much as you can push local purchasing and supporting local farmers, that's something that you want to do. And also, as I mentioned before, being in sync with your local ecosystem of actually understanding, like, these are the things that are in season right now. These are the things that the environment can support, will actually help you naturally make more sustainable food choices. And also another thing to consider is that when you buy locally, you have a better guarantee that that food is not drastically impacting the environment just because we have better checks locally. So for example, in the United States, we do have environmental protection laws that ensure that they're not willy-nilly kind of like spraying pesticides on people or, flooding, destroying waterways or chopping down rainforests. However, once you get out of the country, that's no longer as easy to verify. So there's many reports out there in terms of case studies where, a USDA organic certified palm oil factory out in, Indonesia might be cutting down rainforests to create their organic palm oil. So there's not really things that you can do in terms of addressing that when you're out of the country. So those are all reasons why you want to generally trend towards local foods. So getting into the economic and environmental justice aspects of foods, this is also important from a sustainability perspective because we want our people to thrive and we want to have economic fairness and economic justice when it comes to dealing with our local communities. So a big problem with the way that the US kind of delivers and creates food is that there's been a massive problem with the corporatization of farming. So you can pretty much watch any Netflix documentary on food and get depressed about how much corporatization is going on when it comes to mass producing our food. So instead of, as we mentioned before, there's a lot of environmental impacts that come out of over processing food, right? However, most food is coming from these major factories, which are really just trying to make a buck. So they're packing cattle together in these tiny feedlots, creating massive amounts of environmental impacts. They're just trying to turn out food as quickly as possible. So there's a lot of unsustainable and unhealthy practices. Just some common examples is that there are hog farms in North Carolina coming out of these massive, bacon factories, where basically they have sewage ponds that will actually break open and create natural disasters, or almost EPA Superfund sites where basically all that sewage rolls out into a waterway and completely destroys the ecosystem. As you probably know, you've heard lots about reports of salmonella outbreaks from unsafe and unsanitary conditions coming out of your food. How many recalls have you heard in your lifetime? So those are all health factors that result from having unsustainable practices. Also, that's not even factoring in the labor aspect of it. So just in terms of social justice issues, the massive oppression of migrant labor, or basically making sure that that labor workers have no right to unionize or to actually have fair wages, and using immigration status against them. So there's a lot of corruption in terms of trying to keep labor super cheap in order to produce, food for as minimal pennies on the dollar as they can. So there's a lot of issues tied into that. Also, in terms of the food production, moving on to the actual food distribution, there's also a lot of inequality and issues with the way that food is distributed. So a major issue that we face, especially here in Los Angeles County, is food deserts. So basically, food deserts are a measure of do we have communities where there's not a lot of income and there's not a lot of mobility or access to mass transit in order to access food. So a good measure of whether there's a food desert near you is, do you have a Whole Foods? So generally you can only really find Whole Foods in very ritzy areas, right? Because that's the only place that you can access kind of like these organic foods that people are willing to pay dollar for. So that represents a inequality issue in terms of, are we equally providing access to healthy foods, fruits, and vegetables to our lower income communities? In many cases, we're not. And also there's the issue of food insecurity of, in addition to providing access, do people actually have the resources to be able to get food when they need it? So if you look at where we're located, the map to your right is actually the USDA map of food deserts, where there's overlays between low income and low access and low mobility, all integrated into a particular community. So if you look at the red area where we're located, you can see we're immediately surrounded by major food deserts. And if you think about where most of our students are commuting from, a lot of them are coming from food deserts as well. So the resources that we provide as a university are really critical in helping alleviate a lot of these food deserts that students are commuting to and from. So there's different ways that you can address food deserts, and anything you can do to support services or access or things that will alleviate food deserts are all good things that you want to basically contribute to. For example, the Every Table at the LSU, a lot of people don't realize it's actually a very sustainable business model in terms of the social justice and food desert issue. So their whole principle was actually founded on addressing food deserts in South LA. So they have a built-in sliding scale for the cost of food, which is really cool. So for example, if they have a location in West LA where people are generally more affluent and can afford it, a salad might be $13 because that's the cost of that they can pay. However, if you come down to our campus, that same salad might only be $6 because they understand there's an inequality in terms of being able to buy food resources in different communities. So that's actually built into their business model. And in terms of our campus specifically, about 62% of our students have identified as food insecure. So the more that we can provide easy food access and access to healthy options, those are all things that are going to help our communities and help our students. So the major takeaways, and it's a lot of information, but basically what I want you to take away is that there's really no one silver bullet when it comes to food. You can't just make a fast rule and just kind of like always make the sustainable choice. It really does take a conscientious effort to think about where is your food coming from before you go buy it or put it in your mouth. And in terms of rules of thumb, generally bigger animals tend to need bigger amounts of input. So that's kind of a good indicator that you should want to switch to a smaller animal if you absolutely must have your animal protein in order to save greenhouse gases. Also, if you can, integrating more vegetarian and vegan foods because they have fewer steps to provide those calories, which means they have less environmental impact. Again, there's some exceptions or vegetables and fruits that require more water inputs than others. So again, trying to focus more on like local ecosystems and locally available seasonal items will help with that. And also, again, not getting tricked by over-processed vegan products, and in general, just focusing on whole and unprocessed foods because there's going to be fewer inputs as a result of that manufacturing process. Also on the social aspects, consider supporting local economies and supporting the things and services and businesses that actually create access to healthy and sustainable food in communities. So we brought up a few examples like shopping at the farmer's market, maybe purchasing CSA boxes, donating to your local food pantries, basically frequenting businesses with a social justice mission, and being more conscientious about where your dollars are going. And also, in general, you always want to feed people with edible food as opposed to throwing it into the landfill. So wherever you can actually take edible food and give that to people instead, that's always going to be a win for the environment as well as our communities. So how you as a Toro can help specifically is that we do have several resources at Cal State Dominguez Hills to help create a sustainable food system. So that starts with grazing responsibly, or basically making equitable decisions when you decide to purchase food items. So one of the top ways you can really help is to incorporate more vegan and vegetarian options into your meals. If you're a hardcore carnivore, as I know some of you are, you don't necessarily need to go, like completely vegan in order to make a difference. Again, you can start incorporating it more frequently as part of a meatless Monday, or just trying it out a couple of times a week. Also, switching to a smaller animal when you absolutely must have your protein will, or maybe taking smaller servings of that protein will still help with your greenhouse gas impact. And also, you want to support eateries that have a sustainability or social justice mission or benefit. So instead of just blindly picking food based on what you feel like eating that day, actually think about what that business is doing for the community when you're deciding to spend your food dollars. Another thing that you can do is actually support local produce. So you can get really hands-on by volunteering at our campus urban farm, which is actually located on campus and accepts volunteers year-round, where we actually directly grow produce for the campus food pantries as well as campus dining. And you can visit the sustainability website if you'd like to sign up for a volunteer orientation and get involved that way. Though if you don't want us to get dirty, you can also just do your shopping at the weekly campus farmers market. So we work very hard to bring a weekly farmers market to campus on the South Walkway every Tuesday. And what we brought them to campus because they provide a lot of benefits. So in addition to giving the campus options for purchasing, fresh from the farm local produce, the market itself actually provides EBT services. So students who are on EBT can actually spend their dollars there. And on top of that, they also offer a market match benefit, which basically doubles those EBT dollars. So students who are on EBT can actually turn in 10 of their EBT dollars and get $20 in vouchers back to spend directly at the market, which essentially doubles their food budget when shopping there. So in terms of benefits to in-need students, that's a huge resource, and we definitely want to encourage people to frequent the farmers market to help encourage those vendors to come back and continue providing that service to our students. So finally, when you get to the point of, you made your food choices, you can still help avoid waste and make a big difference. So one of the ways you can get directly involved is volunteering with the Sustainability Club. Who actually provides food recovery efforts once a week to dining. So every Monday they go to dining and take all of the edible food that was perfectly fine but just couldn't sell for whatever reason, and actually donate that directly to the food pantries. Additionally, if you're a campus event organizer or are affiliated with people who organize campus events, definitely download the CSUDH Eats app. So this is a separate app that IT developed, which is designed to notify students when there's extra food on campus. So if you have these big events where there's tons of leftover lunch boxes or sandwiches or anything else that you don't want to just necessarily just dump into the trash, you can use the Eats app to notify hungry students and have them show up at your event and actually eat up all the extra food that's otherwise going to go to the landfill. So it's a good way to support hungry students while also preventing extra food from ending up in the landfill instead of going and feeding people. So if you're all at the point where you've gotten food where it's no longer edible for whatever reason, like maybe it's half eaten or maybe it's going bad, instead of just dumping it into the trash can, we do have compost bins available to you on campus. There's there's a compost bin in front of every major building on campus, as well as the East Walkway. So by putting your food scraps into the compost bin, you can actually ensure that that material ends up into compost as well as biogas, as opposed to just ending up in the landfill and creating more greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a far better end disposal option for you if you've really exhausted all the other options in terms of avoiding food waste. So definitely take advantage of that. Find your nearest compost bin, and incorporating just any of these activities on a regular basis can really help with our environmental impact as a campus. So hopefully that presentation was informative. If you'd like to test your comprehension of these different concepts, you can take our 5-question quiz, which is available in the description section of this YouTube video. So basically, hopefully this has been informative for you. Enjoy, and remember to graze responsibly when you're out on campus.